Science in the early years. Encouraging children to work scientifically. When we look at the science curriculum as a whole, there are three main aims. There's the idea of ensuring that all pupils develop scientific knowledge and conceptual understanding, and that will gradually develop into the specific disciplines of biology, chemistry and physics. So that's basically about scientific knowledge. The second strand is to develop understanding of the nature and the processes and the methods of science through exploring different types of science inquiries that will help them to answer scientific questions about the world around them. So that's about doing science, working scientifically, developing inquiry skills. That sits very well with the characteristics of effective learning in the foundation stage. And then the third strand is to equip them with the scientific knowledge that's required to understand the uses and implications of science today and for the future. So that's to educate them as citizens who will be using and developing science. So we have those three strands that are all interwoven into when we look at the curriculum as a whole throughout schooling. In order for children to operate as successful scientists, they will need a wide range of essential inquiry skills, and these skills should build upon opportunities to play and explore and create and engage in active learning and thinking critically, and those all come through in the early years foundation stage. What are scientific inquiry skills? Well, they involve asking questions, observing and measuring, planning and setting up different types of scientific inquiries, identifying things and classifying them, performing tests, gathering and recording data, reporting and presenting and communicating data and findings to other people, and using a variety of equipment. So those things will all be involved. This is true in adult science, but it's also going to be true in the science that children are doing throughout their schooling. When we think about some of the key things that we are working on in the early years, these are the kinds of things that we want children to be doing in terms of their scientific skills. So I have my own ideas, I test my ideas, I notice similarities and differences, I can use my senses and look closely, I use equipment and tools carefully, I can create simple representations of people and objects, I can talk about things like plants, animals, natural and found objects. I begin to use science words and I question why things happen. So these are the kinds of things, you can see how well they fit in with the early years curriculum and with the characteristics of effective learning. These are the kinds of things we want children to be doing as scientists in the early years. So just developing that into the features that you'll see that link up to the characteristics of effective learning. We're going to want children to show curiosity about objects, events and people, question why things happen, engage in open-ended activity, take a risk, engage in new experiences and learn by trial and error, develop ideas of grouping, sequencing, cause and effect, know about similarities and differences, for example, in objects and materials and in living things, comment and ask questions about the natural world, closely observe the world around them and use their senses to explore the world. Continuing on, so we want them to make links and notice patterns in their experience, choose the resources they need for an activity, handle equipment and tools effectively, create simple representations of objects, etc., answer how and why questions, explain why some things occur and talk about change, make observations of animals and plants, and build up a vocabulary that reflects the breadth of their experience. I want to talk a little bit now about the idea of science capital, which was particularly developed by Louise Archer. So this is the idea that children need to build up a sense of themselves as a scientist and to build up a knowledge of and a confidence around science. So what does it involve? It involves seeing yourself as a scientist, finding out about science, seeing science as relevant to your life, seeing yourself working in science and knowing people who are scientists. There are often assumptions about scientists that operate quite widely in society, that they're clever, that they wear white coats, for example, etc. And science is seen as something that's not for me and my family. And people can have quite a narrow view of what a scientist is. It tends to be men, particularly white and Asian men, who are the most likely to study science. Young children do enjoy science. Science has been part of the primary curriculum for 20 years or more, but there's been no increase in those studying science later on or in choosing science careers. So there's something going wrong in that process. If you rule out science, you're ruling out a lot of jobs that have got status and high incomes. So children need to think of themselves as scientists. They need to do science at home. They need to meet scientists. They need to understand how science impacts on their lives, and they need to know that what they do is science. And we don't always use that word with them. Ways that you can help. One thing is to send home science homework. You can have investigations for staff to explore. You can have an evening for parents to explore science, and add science opportunities across the curriculum. So, for example, think about science opportunities in the role play area. Think about inviting scientists into school, not just medical people, but those who work in industry, etc. We can often have quite a negative view of industry, and we need to maybe address that. Those people may need support to pitch their talk at the right level, obviously, but with encouragement they'll be able to do that, and this is really going to be opening up children's eyes to a much deeper, better understanding of science and science careers. Another thing to do is to make it clear how scientists influence children's lives. So there are scientists who develop Lego bricks, there are scientists who design and improve bicycles, there are scientists who develop medicines, there are scientists who act as sport physiotherapists. So relate all of this to the children's interests. The importance of first-hand experience. One of the ways that you can really demonstrate how important first-hand experience is to work with an apple. So if you start off by examining a real apple, and then you can think about all of the words that you can use to describe it. And that will be about feel, about texture, about smell, about all of the senses can be involved in that. You may get 50 or 60 words. If you replace that real apple with a plastic apple, then and cross out all of the words that will no longer apply. So for example, you're going to have lost quite a lot of the feel of the apple, the texture of the apple, the smell of the apple. So a number of those words will no longer be generated by that experience. If you then go to a simple picture of an apple, you're going to lose even more of the experience. Even less of the vocabulary will be relevant. So one thing that really is important to understand is that pictures are not enough if you lack first-hand experience. So they're a useful reminder of first-hand experience, but they really cannot compensate for it. One of the things I want to talk about now is about vocabulary and about developing and enhancing children's vocabulary. This is something we've been talking about for a while now, thinking about vocabulary in its broad way, so not just scientific vocabulary, but we're going to particularly talk about scientific vocabulary in this session. One of the things that I think is very easy to do is to really use quite a restricted range of words with the children and not expose them to the rich variety of vocabulary that can relate to a particular subject. So one way of working on that is to actually generate little word banks related to books, which we've already started to do, but also relating to particular aspects of science. So a good example would be the kind of vocabulary that might be used when we're talking about dentists, but in the role play area, when we're reading stories about the dentist. So when we're exploring in that week, when we do focus on dentist books and the ideas about the dentist, and we could also be using these at other times of the year too. But to have a bank of resources is really helpful for the adults as well, because we all need reminders of some of the vocabulary that we could be using. So here just, some dentist vocabulary. Some of these might come quite readily to mind, like checkup, appointment, toothbrush, but some of them, if we don't create a vocabulary bank to start off with to support us, we might not get as much vocabulary and as many opportunities for learning new words as we can. So we might not think about you talking about the different kinds of teeth, the canine, the incisor, the molar. We want to be using words like fluoride, enamel. So really just broadening out from the very familiar everyday words that we might think of to just deepening that for the children. And it will be great to have these kinds of vocabulary word banks for each of the aspects of science and for all of the kinds of books that have a scientific aspect to them. Another really good idea is to think about how can you make the maximum use of exploration of the natural world. So this is just an example from one of the training sessions that I attended. And in this particular session, they were suggesting having a little exploration rucksack, a little collection of resources that the children could use. So things you might put in an exploration rucksack: a tape measure, ruler, magnifier, a clipboard, a little guide to wildlife, and maybe some binoculars. Some ideas for collecting things. Well, one suggestion was to have labels for finds. So if you're collecting leaves, that you actually have little labels that you can write, that the children can write something on, that so they can remember where they found that particular leaf, or any kind of comments, anything that they think is worth noting. Another kind of resource is to have double-sided tape on card and gradually peel off. So that's you kind of have a little strip that you can collect things on, and you control that by just the child can just gradually peels off the tape so it doesn't get stuck to everything. One sort of reminder was that you only collect fairy pinches or very tiny pinches of things. So the idea is you're collecting in a small and non-destructive way. Another possible way of collecting things is to use a mini envelope, and one thing to sort of explain to the children about what's appropriate to collect and what's not is to have something like, if it can walk, don't put it in. So obviously this is not suitable for little mini beasts, which would need different kinds of containers. So it's more something that would work well for plants, for sticks, for fruits that are found on the ground, and so on. That would also apply obviously to the sticky tape card, because we don't want mini bees stuck onto that either. Tick off guides, we've used those a bit, so a sort of a kind of guide with pictures and boxes to tick for different kinds of flowers, different kinds of trees, different kinds of mini bees, so the children go around and see if they can spot the different kinds of objects that we want them to have a look at. And then obviously books, guides, they could be books about trees, books about mini bees, some kind of resource that's going to help the children with understanding a bit more about what they find and help them with identification. I think it's quite helpful to have a look at the Year 1 science and to see after the early years, after the foundation stage, what kinds of things are the children particularly going to be focused on in terms of science in that year 1, just because it gives us a sense about, not to feel that we're needing to cover that ground, but to give a sense about where what we're doing is leading, because actually we'll see that there's a lot of connection and we're already introducing some of these ideas at this stage. So there's 4 sort of sections: plants, animals including humans, everyday materials, and seasonal changes. And again, they will all be things that are quite familiar to you, and you will appreciate we're already exploring some of those things in the foundation stage. So plants, the children are taught to identify and name a variety of common, wild and garden plants, including deciduous and evergreen trees. The deciduous ones are the ones that shed their leaves in the autumn. And there was also identify and describe the basic structure of a variety of common flowering plants, including trees. So we're talking about the basic structure, things like the roots, the stem, the shoots, the leaves, the flowers, and maybe the different parts of the flowers. And again, similar sort of idea with trees, things like bark and the trunk, and buds, twigs, so understanding the basic structure of plants. And in the animals section, the children are taught to identify and name a variety of common animals, including fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals, so exploring across the kind of range of living creatures. And identify and name a variety of common animals and understand the difference between the carnivores, which eat meat, the herbivores, which eat plants, and omnivores, which eat both. Describe and compare the structure of a variety of common animals. So that will be again fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals, and that would include pets where they're going to be able to have more easily direct experience. So just thinking about the different features of those different groups of animals and being able to talk about simply in it about their structure. And then also some work on the human body, so identifying, naming, drawing and labelling the basic parts of the human body and say which part of the body is associated with each sense. And again, you can kind of see we're already doing a lot of work on that in the early years. The next section is everyday materials, and that's perhaps something where we could explore that in a little more depth. Interestingly, in the New Development Matters, that's pulled out slightly more as well, which I think is quite helpful. It's probably one of the areas in which people are a bit less confident. So pupils should be taught to distinguish between an object and the material from which it's made. So that's just basically understanding that things that, different objects are made of different kinds of stuff. So the book is made of paper, the computer is made of lots of different kinds of things, but you might obviously see some plastic and some metal. A comb is made of plastic, so you're distinguishing between the actual object, the comb, and what the material is that it's made of. And lots of different things can be made of plastic, different kinds of objects. So that's one idea for the children to understand and explore. Then there will also be identifying and naming a variety of everyday materials, and they would include things like wood, plastic, glass, metal, water and rock. And that's quite a useful little list for us to bear in mind in making sure we're kind of exposing children to that range. I think we are naturally, but we may not always be pulling those ideas out. Important to think that to appreciate that materials are not always solids. So water is a material, and other kinds of liquids, vinegar is a material. Also, there's the idea that air and gases are materials too. So certainly to appreciate that the air is another kind of material. It's made up of different kinds of gases, but probably it's enough at the moment, for early years, just from the point of view of understanding that the air is another kind of material that is all around us, and some of its properties is enough. Then there's the idea about being able to describe the simple physical properties of a variety of everyday materials. I think that's something we could usefully expand and develop. But these can be things like hardness, whether they're transparent, whether they're waterproof. So we're talking about simple physical properties. And then being able to compare and group together a variety of everyday materials on the basis of their simple physical properties. So one example that we quite often do is to sort things into things that are magnetic and things that are not magnetic, but there are other things we could be sorting by, waterproof and not waterproof, hard and soft. So it's about, classifying in that simple way. And then the fourth part, the seasonal changes. One of the ideas about doing the Weather Week last academic year was to actually really develop a bit more of a understanding about how we could encourage children to think about the weather and to think about seasons, because it's something we have a lot of experience of, but we don't necessarily develop that, again, using some vocabulary and just to deepen that understanding a little bit. So in year one, the idea is basically to observe change across the 4 seasons, and I think that's something we do, but we could possibly pull that idea out a little bit more explicitly, and to observe and describe the weather associated with the seasons. So that's again something that children are very interested in, the weather, and I think the idea about just giving them a bit more understanding about the weather, talking about the weather using some more of the vocabulary. Talking about things like the wind and the effect of the wind, and the fact that you get different sort of speeds of wind and they have different effects. Looking at the kinds of clouds that you might see on different days, talking about whether the day is sunny or cloudy, talking about how much rain falls and maybe some kind of collecting rainfall. So that kind of just deepening that initial great interest and getting more scientific understanding from it. The other thing that they focus on a little bit in year one as well is to talk about how the day length varies. And I think that's something that we often do mention, particularly as sort of the winter comes and the day and it starts to get dark really quite early. We do draw children's attention to that, but just maybe, you know, getting them to reflect how that's changing over the course of the year. So you can see already that a lot of the ideas that are coming through and are being explored in Year 1 science are ideas that we're already introducing in the early years. Just to think a little bit more about vocabulary and introducing vocabulary to children and helping them to really understand what each new word means. I just want to mention and remind people that we did explore in one of the training courses that some of us did was a model called the Freya model, and I do think there's something quite helpful in that we might want to bear in mind. So what the Freya model involves is 4 different sort of steps to really make sure that a child's understanding of a new word is solid. Basically, you start off with the definition of the word, like distribute, that makes sense to the children. So for distribute, that's something like giving out in a fair way, sharing out. And then obviously, you know, you'll need to think carefully about what would be appropriate ways to explain a range of words, and scientific words, but, you know, just to think about translating that into something that's simple and makes sense to the children. Then you will think of examples that they could relate to. So, for example, that might be distributing Easter eggs or distributing slices of apple or baked beans at lunchtime. So instead of just sticking to the word like giving out, sharing out, you're adding in a new word, but you're adding it in a meaningful context. You then think about the characteristics that you need to make the word distribute appropriate. So what are the kind of factors for that particular word? You need something that's shared out, you need a number of people that get something, and you need somebody who's doing the giving out. So these are all the kind of things that have to be there in order for that word to work. And again, that's about thinking about the word just in a little bit more depth to tease apart what the actual meaning is. And then the other thing that's really helpful is to think of non-examples to make it clear the word doesn't apply in those cases. And it's actually, there's quite a lot of research to show we don't often do that. We tend to just present examples that are examples, but actually non-examples are really helpful for learning, because it means that children are kind of able to sort things into places where that word works and places where it doesn't work, and that's certainly something that they need to explore. So, for example, if one person just holds a basket of Easter eggs, we can explain that's not distributing. Nor if they give all of the baked beans to just one person. Nor if they go around with their basket collecting apples into it rather than sharing them out. And you can present these examples as videos or images as well as in first-hand experiences. So obviously there's a lot of value in first-hand experiences, but not everything is going to be able to be presented in first-hand ways. And it's helpful, and also, you know, videos can be a useful sort of summary as well. So a kind of combination of actual experiences and linked up with video experiences, often, you know, well linked to stories, that can be very helpful. Now, I just want to go through a few resources that are useful. The kids should see this. We've already had a look at this site a couple of times, but it's an excellent resource bank of videos. A lot of them have got scientific focus. Some of the audio tracks might need simplifying, but a lot of the imagery is really good, and they're certainly very helpful in if you want to present new kind of ideas to children. That's one of the first sites to have a look at. Then we've got the STEM organisation website. Again, that's got a lot of ideas for science teaching. It's got activity packs. There's not, and there are different sort of activities as well. Quite a lot of them are geared to slightly older children, but there are some early years resources, and there are some resources, things like odd one out, or where you've got 3 different pictures and you have to say which is the odd one out, or some close sort of observational pictures to encourage close observation, which are, you know, either are intended for early years or can be adapted to work. So that's a really good sort of resource website to go to. Another site that I like is Teach Preschool. The person who runs this site was somebody who's been featured on Early Years TV, interviewed by Kathy Brodie. That's another website with lots of ideas for activities, and that's obviously particularly focused on the early years. It's got short, accessible kinds of early years activities, and quite a lot of them do include science. I think another thing that's important for adults to do in terms of science is to develop their own knowledge. It's not an area in which everybody is confident in their own knowledge, and it's also, you know, we may have known these things a long time ago, but we've forgotten them, and we need to remind ourselves of some things. So it is important to develop your own knowledge, and that helps you be more confident as well. You don't need to know everything though, and that's important. You don't have to be an expert in all aspects of science. You can be an important role model in finding out what you don't know. So if you can, if a child asks a question, you actually don't know the answer, then you can show how we might go about finding an answer to something which we don't know. It's better not to guess at an answer. It's much better to go to sort of admit you don't know and to say, let's find out. What can we do to find out, and to learn with the children. Now, in order to show you one way of developing your own understanding, we're going to use a website called Reach Out CPD. And what we're all going to do is we're all going to complete a module on this website. Doesn't take very long, and maybe half an hour or so to go through one of the modules, and do as much as you can. It's split. The module you're going to do is split up into 4 units. So start with the first unit, see how far you get on. And what there is there's some information to read about the subject. There's normally a video and a little point at which you can kind of pause and do some reflection. So the module, there's a section called Lower Primary, which is a section we're going to work with. And there's a section there called Everyday Material, a course there called Everyday Materials, and that's the one we're going to do. I've picked that one because it's an area that is increasingly being included in development matters, and it's an area where people may be a little less confident than perhaps with something like humans and other animals, or living things and habitats, where I think we probably are more confident. There are some other courses which I think will be particularly useful for people. Seasonal changes would be one, and some understanding about planet Earth and space. And then the other 2 are light and sound and energy. I think those are probably the 4 areas which we've explored less as a staff. And so if you enjoy one of the courses, you might well want to go and have a look at some of the others, and if we're feeling that it's a useful thing to do as a staff, we might allocate another course to do to all the staff later on as well. So that's the one we're going to start with. So what you will need to do is, it's all free, but you will need to set up an account and you will need to sign in, because it keeps track of your progress through the course. You don't have to do it in one go. You can do a section and then have a little break and then go back and do the next one. And you might want to take some notes. I think it's possible to download some notes, so you certainly can cut and paste. So you don't necessarily have to write everything out if you do want to keep some notes from the course. But if it's a site that's recommended by people who teach us how to teach science. And there's other sort of sections to it, thinking about working scientifically and some ideas for that, and from ideas about doing science outdoors. So it's a really good resource and well worth exploring. So I hope you enjoy that. So if you enjoyed this course, as I was saying, and you found it helpful, there are other short courses to try. There's a nice wide variety, and certainly very much recommended. And these are all about building up your own confidence with science, your own understanding of scientific concepts, your own scientific vocabulary, because that will help you be more confident and be able to take the children's learning on in a deeper way. So there are 2 handouts that are going to be useful that you're going to have access to, and these are the 2 activity packs that have been produced by other people are just full of ideas of different sort of activities that will work in the early years. The first one was produced for British Science Week in 2019. I don't think they did one this year. They may do one next year, but anyway, it's fine. They They will work any time of the year and they don't go out of date. So this was produced by the British Science Association, and there are lots of activities in there that are particularly designed for early years and well worth trying out. The second handout from somebody else is from Juliet Robertson, who runs Creative Star website. This handout is called Pack Away Outdoor Play. It's really designed for nurseries that perhaps don't have great outside space and have to move things in and out. So it's made very flexible and easy to kind of to move it and to change things. It's also nurseries that don't have very much money, so it's about things that can be done on a budget with everyday materials. They're not all science things, but there are quite a lot of ideas and activities that do relate to science, particularly some of the ideas that relate to water play, and also ideas around pulleys. And pulleys are something we haven't really used very much or developed very much, so I think it'd be really worth exploring how we might set those up and how that might work, and her ideas for that. Then the third little handout is quite a short one, which is basically some notes from a session that I went to when I went to a STEM conference. Claire Seeley was talking about learning outside, particularly learning about the natural world. And some of these ideas, again, will possibly be familiar to you, but there were some useful tips and hints for ways that you could, add just slightly new things into what we already do quite well. So thank you very much for listening to the video. I hope you found it useful. And I hope you now enjoy going off to doing your Reach Out CPD and enjoy finding out more about materials. There are some, obviously, do follow up if there's any of the things that catch your attention. You're most welcome to explore things in greater detail, and it will be interesting to see what we can do with our children and how we can move their scientific understanding forward. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.